What I would like to do today is give you a brief overview of the idea that the spatial heterogeneity or physical complexity of rivers is a very important component of rivers as ecosystems. So by way of background, I think a couple of things are important. The idea that how people perceive river corridors, which I use to refer to channels and floodplains, is an important component of how we manage them and what we expect to see. Where you are in the world in terms of the environmental context, the geomorphic process domain, and the geographic location is very important. And then the whole question of what is natural. If you're trying to restore to a more natural state, which is often the case for river corridors, that's not a static condition. So what was the natural range of variability? How can you determine what the river corridor looked like prior to intensive human alteration? So what are the reference conditions? What's the history of land use at the site? And fundamentally, what are the natural water and sediment regimes? And these are all very difficult questions to address. So I'll start with this idea of shifting baseline of perception. This is actually the inside front cover of an English textbook on river pollution. And of course, everyone would agree that this is a very unhealthy, unattractive river. But what I found interesting was the opposing front cover, which is very bucolic and much more attractive. But the more I looked at it, the more I thought, well, if this is supposed to be England, England historically was densely forested. There's very little forest cover along this river. The river has a very uniform width. There's no indication of bed forms. It's a pretty limited riparian zone. The more I looked at it, the more I thought, well, that's an interesting juxtaposition. So I'll come back to that idea at the end of the talk. But looking at the idea of environmental context and the question of what is natural, one way I think about this is the interaction between fluxes into and through the river corridor. So the natural fluxes of water, sediment, and in forested regions, large wood entering the river and moving down the river network. And those interacting with context that you could think of as being best described at the reach scale. So where are you in the river network, say the headwaters or lowlands? What are the natural spatial limits on the river corridor? The photo on the left in this box is a very narrow canyon. It's the Grand Canyon in Colorado River. The photo on the right, that's a small channel up in a tributary of the Yukon River in central Alaska, vast lowlands where the river can meander freely with very little lateral constraint. So those spatial limits govern form and function in river corridors. The erosional resistance of the channel boundaries as a function of things like sediment or bedrock composition, riparian vegetation, the presence of large wood, those are important in terms of how they interact with the fluxes. And finally, whether the base level is stable or not downstream will have a strong influence on that context. So these are all the things I've mentioned so far are natural aspects at the reach scale, but of course humans strongly influence all of these. We don't change position in the network or valley geometry, but we certainly impose constraints on how the river interacts with the context through building structures such as levees or dams, for example. So that interaction between fluxes and context results in a characteristic spatial heterogeneity or physical complexity, differing levels of lateral, longitudinal, and vertical connectivity, resilience, which is you could think of as the ability to recover following disturbance, and geomorphic and ecological integrity. Ecological integrity is a more well-known concept, but Will Graff referred to physical integrity more than 20 years ago, and I'm just calling it geomorphic integrity here. It's the ability of the channel and floodplain or the river corridor to adjust to changes in water and sediment discharge. The greater the ability to adjust in the absence of human constraints, the greater the geomorphic integrity. And then the lower level here is just a series of specific examples of characteristics that reflect these interactions: the channel gradient, plan form, the degree to which the floodplain is inundated, the riparian water table, etc. And all of these interactions, all of this context occurs within a river corridor. And again, river corridor, as it's commonly being defined now, is the active channel, the floodplain, and the underlying hyporeic zone. And I think for people who are river scientists, this is all very intuitive and obvious, but it's not so obvious to people outside the river science community, and it's not at all obvious in a regulatory context. In the United States, for example, the channel and the floodplain are considered very separate entities. They're not viewed as being part of an integrative continuum, and nobody even talks about the hyporheic corridor or groundwater. So this illustration from a paper by Harvey and Gusev that was published a few years ago is meant to emphasize how strongly coupled the different components of the river corridor are, and really how artificial it is to separate them and not think of them interacting. So I think if we conceptualize rivers as river corridors rather than simply channels, then it can be easier to think about the interactions between physical processes and forms, chemical aspects like water quality, nutrient uptake, and the biota in that river corridor. I think it also really helps to be very explicit about the interactions between the channel, floodplain, and hyporheic zone if you're talking about a river corridor. Okay, so having said all that, what exactly do I mean by physical complexity or spatial heterogeneity? Stream bed. As you go downstream, anything that makes the stream different than a simple, homogeneous, or uniform channel, say an irrigation canal, is a source of physical complexity. So differences in grain size distribution, the presence of bed forms here, a channel spanning logjam that's creating differences in the stream bed in terms of grain size distribution and organic matter. The banks, again, anything that causes a channel to deviate from a straight uniform canal. So small scale irregularities, as you see here in a subalpine meadow, small channel, or meander bends, other sources of irregularities associated with expansions and constrictions, or root wads, large boulders, etc. Cross-sectional form. If you have bed forms or meander bends, if you have, say, going between pools and riffles or steps and pools, there are differences in the cross-sectional form. And certainly the plan form. Characteristics that can be described as sinuosity or the number of channels if you have a braided channel or an anastomosing channel. All of these are, again, things that cause the river to deviate from the simplest configuration, which would be like an irrigation canal. So what causes this? Well, fundamentally, it's water, sediment, and in forested regions, large wood moving through the river corridor, and what I call biotic drivers. So riparian vegetation and in the northern hemisphere beaver are examples of that. Those processes influence sediment erosion and deposition and create non-uniformities in erosion and deposition along or throughout a river corridor. And a lot of that erosion and deposition occurs in association with lateral channel movement, whether it's gradual migration or avulsion, and both temporal and spatial changes in the bed forms in the channel, or the substrate characteristics, the cross-sectional geometry, and the plan form of the channel. So these are basically the geomorphic processes that create physical complexity. Why does it matter? Well, one aspect is habitat abundance and diversity for riparian and aquatic organisms. And an example here, this is an underwater view in the backwater of a logjam. You can see the logjam a little bit at left, the big white arrows indicating flow direction. You can see some very coarse material on the bed substrate, and the big gray mass at the back of the photo is a huge boulder that protrudes above the flow. In the absence of obstructions, such as log jams, the bed material in these channels is bouldery. They're step pool channels. Where there's an obstruction, you can see in the foreground there's much finer sediment that's trapped, organic matter. It creates very important habitat for aquatic insects, and you can actually see a salmonid, a trout, in silhouette in the back of the photo, enjoying the nice backwater habitat. The second implication, resistance to change and resilience after change or disturbance, and examples in rivers, fire, flood, drought, and a very short time scale. More prolonged disturbances would be climate change or resource use. And an example here comes from what's known as a beaver meadow. It's a portion of the river corridor in which beavers build multiple dams, create large areas of ponded water, and often a multi-channel planform. The upper photo, again, the white arrow indicates flow direction. That's showing one of these beaver meadows in the autumn. The valley bottom is filled with very dense willow thickets, which you can see in the lower photo, which actually is, it's hard to tell in this photo, but it's looking upstream and there are three small channels coming together. So the beavers create an anastomosing channel planform. They also enhance overbank flows and infiltration So it creates a very high riparian water table with a lot of hypereic exchange and maintains a very wet valley bottom. When there is a wildfire or drought, this high riparian water table buffers this portion of the river corridor against those disturbances. When there's a flood, the floodwaters spread out through this very densely vegetated valley bottom and lose a lot of their hydraulic force because of the high hydraulic resistance. In contrast to that, when the beaver are removed from or leave an area, this is another portion of Rocky Mountain National Park that has lost beaver over the last few decades. The channel has reverted to a single channel. There's very heavy grazing here by native elk, and they've destroyed much of those those dense willow communities. So you go to something that ecologists call an elk grassland. It's an alternative stable state where you have a single incised channel, a much drier riparian corridor. And there was a wildfire that started upstream from this riparian zone and burned into the zone. That probably almost certainly would not have happened if the beaver were still there, creating physical complexity and resilience. And as an example, this is a photo from my colleague Joe Wheaton at Utah State, an area in Idaho after a fire. You can see the uplands were completely burned, but the river corridor, which again has been modified by beavers, withstood the fire very nicely. So it was much more resistant and resilient to that disturbance. A third implication, the ability of the river corridor to retain material moving downstream, whether that's water, attenuating flood peaks, or storing higher flow in hypereic and groundwater. Sediment, if you have physical complexity, whether it's an obstruction in the form of a logjam, as you see here, or just multiple channels, irregular channel margins that create eddies and low velocity zones, you can store mineral sediment. Organic material is often stored with that, as you see in the foreground in this photo, where there's sand-sized material with a lot of twigs and pine needles in there. So if you slow down the movement of material, particularly organic material and solutes, such as nitrogen, you increase the ability for biogeochemical uptake of those nutrients. You can also store contaminants, but in general, the more physically complex a river corridor is, the greater the retention. So that, again, provides biological availability of nutrients, it disperses material, and in the case of things like contaminants, it may dilute the contaminant level for downstream portions of the river network. Another implication is connectivity, and spatial heterogeneity can either increase or decrease connectivity. I tend to think of connectivity within the river corridor as opposed to between the river corridor and the uplands as having these three dimensions of lateral, so the floodplain and channel, longitudinal, upstream, downstream, and vertical for the subsurface and channel. And different forms of physical complexity, again, can increase or decrease that. This photo is a channel that has a beaver lodge in the lower right. It doesn't have a beaver dam at present, but it did in the past. When that beaver dam was present, it would have increased lateral connectivity and vertical connectivity, but decreased longitudinal connectivity. So again, the idea is just that physical complexity influences the form and magnitude of connectivity. Okay, so if I look specifically at rivers in my area, mountain streams, what I see is a dramatic change in many of them over the period since people of European ancestry settled in this region. And mostly these have gone from complex to simpler. And a lot of it's driven by the now absence of channel spanning log jams, which were much more common historically, and the absence of beaver dams, which again were much more widespread historically. Most of the photos I have in this presentation, including this too, are from Rocky Mountain National Park, where there is still old growth forest and active beaver colonies. But in many areas outside the national park, you don't see these features, or they're uncommon. Just looking at log jams very quickly as an example, if a tree falls into a channel and it forms a ramp or bridge piece that has one or both ends above the bankfill channel, that piece is much more stable. So it's more likely to collect a smaller material that's in transport and create a log jam. And the effect of that log jam depends very much on that context, that reach scale context. So this photo was an area that burned in 1978. It's at very high elevation, so the trees are regrowing slowly. But what you see is a very narrow valley bottom The channel spanning logjam here creates a stepped profile, but it doesn't really interact with the floodplain because there is no floodplain. So it's a very local effect of the backwater. It's fairly simple. You get a backwater in a pool. And it's transient because when there are very high flows, there's a lot of hydraulic force that builds up on that jam, and it's likely to fail and be removed. So this is the effect of a logjam in a steep, narrow section of the valley. If you're in a wide, shallow portion, you have a very wide, shallow portion of the valley, you have a very different effect. So the backwater and upstream sedimentation extend farther upstream if it's a low gradient, as you see in the photo at the upper left. That aggradation associated with that backwater pool is likely to create enhanced overbank flow and lateral channel movement or bank erosion. And you can often, if there's enough space in the valley bottom, you can go to channel planform with multiple channels that branch and flow more or less parallel to one another and then rejoin downstream. Each of those channels has bank erosion, so you get more wooded recruitment. So you end up with a spatially extensive change in the valley bottom to this multi-thread planform. It's very complex. The individual secondary channels may be ephemeral or perennial. And the whole scenario is fairly persistent because when there is a large flood, the hydraulic force exerted on each jam is much less because you have overbank flow and you have flow splitting into multiple channels. So this can be a very persistent channel planform as long as there is the presence of sufficient riparian forest to continue to supply wood to the channel when, say, one log jam does blow out. And old growth forest in particular supplies large trees when the trees do fall into the channel or onto the valley bottom. So you're more likely to see this scenario in old growth forest where there are these wide low gradient reaches. And those reaches are much more resilient to floods. And this is based on a 10-year study that I've been doing, surveying once a year a large population of log jams. Those jams are much more persistent and those reaches are more resilient to disturbance. There's much higher biodiversity and biomass in those reaches. They're a little bit like the beaver meadows. They have a high riparian water table and a very abundant and diverse habitat. And OC here stands for organic carbon. They also tend to have a lot of organic carbon stored in the form of down dead wood, but also floodplain soils that are rich in organics and at or close to saturation. So there's very little microbial decomposition and gaseous emission of the carbon that's in the soil. So what evidence do we have that messy or physically complex equals what you might call healthy for river corridors? Well, one is that organic carbon storage, and this is based on Nick Sutphin's PhD work. Those wide low gradient valley segments are less than a quarter of the total river length, but they contain about 3/4 of the carbon present in the valley bottoms, and that's almost a quarter of the total carbon in the landscape, even though the river valleys occupy a very small portion of the landscape. So the valley bottoms are more biologically productive. They have greater net primary productivity. They have greater amounts of downed wood, and they have higher percentages of soil organic carbon. So they're really disproportionately important in storing organic carbon, and a lot of that derives from that messiness or physical complexity associated with large wood and beaver dams. There's much more geomorphic complexity at the reach scale, which translates to greater habitat abundance and diversity. And this was Bridget Leiber's PhD work. It was a collaborative project with ecologists and biogeochemists. And we found that where there's a lot of wood that can be supplied to the channel, mostly old growth forest, you have greater physical channel complexity. And that was indicated by standard deviation of the bed and banks, the amount of backwater, the length of channel per unit length of valley. There's also a lot more fine organic matter, and which is about half carbon, stored in the channels in those areas. And our colleagues who were looking at the biogeochemistry and biota found that there's a greater nutrient uptake, particularly of nitrogen, and there's a greater biomass and diversity of the predators of aquatic insects, so fish and riparian spiders. There are lots of aquatic insects being produced, but they get eaten pretty quickly. And much of this greater biomass in particular has to do with the fact that you have a greater length of channel per unit length of valley where you have multiple channels or sinuous channels. That's a common sense, but it does translate to greater biological productivity. Okay, so I'm just going quickly over a couple of examples of evidence that physical complexity translates to what are typically viewed as desirable characteristics of river corridors. This is all focused on the Colorado Front Range. How about in a global context? Well, we know that old growth forest is almost gone. Humans have reduced forest cover by half, and we've nearly eliminated old growth. So we've lost a lot of those functions in formerly forested river corridors. And ecologists have the idea of alternative states where you can have an ecosystem that has two completely different configurations that are both can remain stable in the absence of disturbance. And my highly technical terms for that are wood-rich and wood-poor. The wood-rich example on the left, of course, you have natural fluctuations through time and space in the amount of wood that's introduced to river corridors. But if there's some wood in the channel, it's very effective at trapping other wood that's in transport, smaller pieces. And you can create these very large log jams as you see in this photo. So as long as some wood is present, you're always going to have wood, even with those fluctuations in wood recruitment. On the other hand, if you take all the wood out and or physically simplify the channels, as you see on the right, there's a tree leaning across that channel, but if that tree falls in, it's much less likely to be trapped and stored. It's more likely to be transported downstream in the absence of physical complexity and obstacles. And the Collins et al. Paper made this point really very nicely for rivers in the Pacific Northwest, demonstrating that historically, or where wood has not been removed, they are these very spatially complex, heterogeneous multi-thread channels, anastomosing for the most part, and where there's a history of timber harvest, and even if you don't directly engineer the channels, you're much more likely to go to a single channel that's much simpler and less retentive, and that has a less diverse floodplain community. So you could go through the same scenario for beavers. I talked about beaver meadows and elk grasslands briefly. So how much physical complexity is good? Messier. Well, it depends on where you are, what that environmental context is, things like position and network, valley geometry. It also strongly depends on what the land use history is. And that is not necessarily a simple thing to understand if there's been a long history of land use and many of the land uses have long been forgotten. Just 3 randomly chosen photos from very different parts of the world. The sources and forms of physical complexity are going to be different in each of these channels. An ephemeral channel in Sardinia, a small channel in the humid rainforest of Borneo, or a mountain river in Colorado. But each of them has some or multiple processes that create spatial heterogeneity and physical complexity. And those forms of physical complexity have very important implications for the characteristics of the river corridor as an ecosystem. So being able to understand those and understand what might be a natural level of physical complexity, I think, is very important. And one way to look at this is from Knighton's, a very nice fluvial textbook. So going from small spatial scales in the lower left to much larger scales along the y-axis, and then short time scales to long time scales on the x-axis. What Knighton's illustrating here is that something like the bed configuration of a sand bed stream changes almost instantaneously over very small, small spatial scales. As you go to the upper right in this figure, you're getting to things like the profile concavity and gradient that are influenced by climate and geology over long time scales. Much of what we do as humans influences the short to intermediate scales, either indirectly through land use or directly through river engineering. And with very few exceptions, the net effect of those activities has been to reduce physical complexity. So we've made our rivers more like irrigation canals, simple, uniform, homogeneous to the extent that we're able. And because of that, we've lost a lot of river function, I think. So as we try to restore some of this complexity and some of this function now, I think we really have to put a lot of emphasis on integrated numerical models that include thresholds, mainly because most things seem to be nonlinear in river corridors. So we have come a long, long way in the last couple decades in coupling hydraulics and sediment transport in 2 or 3D models. Now we need to add some of these other components, such as large wood, if we're looking at forested areas, and start thinking about those processes in the context of spatial heterogeneity across the river corridor, and how that heterogeneity influences 3D fluxes, and then desirable attributes. I've just put two here, organic carbon stock or biomass, but it could be flood attenuation or contaminant storage or dilution. This last oval, you could put a lot of characteristics in there. So my hope is that when you look at a river corridor such as this one, you'll think about those fluxes in 3 dimensions. So fluxes coming from the uplands into the river corridor, going between the channel and floodplain, between the subsurface and the surface and the atmosphere, and upstream, downstream fluxes. Think about the implications in terms of characteristics such as organic carbon stocks in the form of down dead wood, or biomass and biodiversity of riparian vegetation, and thinking about all of those interactions occurring in a river corridor. So coming back to this drawing, I asked one of our grad students who's a good artist to re-envision the boy and the dog, and I don't know what happened to the dog, but now the boy is catching a fish, and there's a forested riparian corridor. There's a little bit of diversity in terms of the ages of that forest. There's down dead wood. There's a secondary channel starting to cut across a point bar. There's clearly some diversity in terms of the bed substrate. There's a more diverse burial zone, or that area of the channel margin that's wetted and dried as flow fluctuates. So I think this illustration would probably be a better representation of what river corridors in England look like historically or under natural conditions. And there's a series of nice papers that have looked at different aspects of how people perceive river corridors and what we consider attractive, and how that influences management. And a last example of that, this is a restoration project from Italy. You can see in 2005, prior to restoration, each of these white lines is a check dam. There was nearly continuous bank stabilization. Obviously, there are communities occupying the floodplain in a variety of land use, so they weren't going to reclaim the whole river corridor, but they removed the check dams and the bank stabilization, allowed the channel to go to a braided planform. And I was there a couple of years ago, and many of these braid bars are becoming vegetated. When this project was first proposed, people were very skeptical in the local community. They were afraid that there would be a lot of property damage, and the river would avulse across the valley bottom. They haven't removed all the bank protection. There are still controls on the river's lateral migration, but there's a little bit more room within the active channel. And I was there in November 2 years ago, and it was kind of a miserable day. It was cold and it was drizzling, and there were so many people out using this river corridor, walking their dogs, jogging, watching birds. And now it's a source of great pride to these adjacent communities, partly because it's won an award for a river restoration project in the EU. So I think I'd come back to that issue of perception. We as river scientists may have a certain understanding of how rivers look, or maybe we think they should look, but that will not be translated into practice unless there's public acceptance. So there are a variety of ways to increase public acceptance of messiness or physical complexity, and I would say that that's a very important task that we face in future. So thank you very much.